And thank you, Neil, for welcoming us all to our Courageous Conversations. We have so much to cover this evening. I'm really excited that all of you could join us. I put in the chat kind of the 6 areas that I broke this down into, and we'll just take them one by one. I have some really great video clips. Thank you, Amy Floan, for providing some of the video clips that we'll be seeing this evening. And we'll pause after each one and have a conversation. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we will get started.
Some of the ways that we understand American gay history is through the Stonewall uprising as a before and after, right? But I think before Stonewall, there was this incredible moment of gay liberation, queer liberation, Black liberation in the 20s in Harlem.
Most people remember learning about the Harlem Renaissance in school. Langston Hughes, blues, jazz, an explosion of artistic talent. But what we don't learn about is that Harlem was also a thriving gay community.
So the way that Harlem became a haven for LGBT life is the way that it became a haven for Black people from all over the world, really. It became this crossroads, right? And the big part of this is the Great Migration, which obviously meant that a lot of Black people came north, especially to cities that are now considered Black cities like Chicago and Harlem in New York City. Was known at the time as the Black Mecca, right? And so it was in some ways the largest Black city in the world. And it did, of course, include a lot of energy and excitement, cabaret, blues, jazz. So it really was in some ways a crossroads of all of these different artistic and musical and cultural energies. A lot of white patrons would go to Harlem, to quote unquote slum, because the mores were much more relaxed. And especially during the Prohibition era, a lot of these were in some ways, speakeasies.
Vices flourished in Harlem because African Americans did not have the political power to be able to demand that government keep these things out of their neighborhood. And the corruption of the police and of judges, all of that enabled gay activity as well as all kinds of other activity to thrive in Harlem.
A lot of the reasons that a lot of Black folks came to Harlem was because they weren't allowed to be in other parts of the city, right? And so again, it's a paradoxical form of freedom that's based out of legal, economic, and political disenfranchisement.
To this day, when people study the Harlem Renaissance, they often don't consider the LGBTQ aspects of it. And part of that is because many of the gay writers did not actually identify as gay.
And Langston Hughes is a wonderful figure in this era because he's considered somewhat queer, but he was never, never fully out politically, whereas Richard Bruce Nugent is the poster boy for someone who was unashamedly out.
And there certainly are many jazz figures who were gay.
Gladys Bentley was notorious for wearing men's clothing in public. I think she would be what we'd call a butch lesbian. And she wore a white tuxedo, and she played with gender.
There was also, of course, the drag ball scene in Harlem, which not everyone talks about. That goes all the way back to the 20s in Harlem. And so it was quite a free time. And ironically, that freedom of sexual expression as well as gender fluidity really petered out. The Great Depression is said to have caused the downfall of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the increasing conservatism in American culture to the Second World War.
That conservatism is one of the reasons the Harlem Renaissance isn't remembered as a time of gay liberation.
So there was a retrospective closeting, so to speak, of these figures. The consequences of not teaching the period of the Harlem Renaissance as being inherently queer is that queerness remains white in the cultural imaginary because we don't have this story of Black queerness. I think a lot of people talk about the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969, and a lot of us are trying to re-understand it as being centered on trans women and trans women of color. And in a sense, it's a similar story where a lot of the Black and brown queer people were the ones who were at the forefront of this movement. And so it's important to uncover this history to, again, recover these ancestors who really led the charge and try to unforget all the liberation that they created.
All right. So our first video really focused on the Harlem Renaissance. And I have some notes here that I want to make sure that I get in the chat. But while I'm pulling those up, same rules as always, please put a question mark in the chat if there's something that you want to share, or you can type it out. I'll go ahead and get that link to the first video out as well, in case anyone would like to have that. A lot of items in that first video. The first one talked about Claude McKay, which some of you may know for his famed poem, If I Must Die. So there are some links in there, a little bit more about Claude McKay. But I will pause. If there's anyone who has comments about the first video or any questions that you want to pose for the group, please go ahead and put a question mark in the chat so I can call on you. And while you're thinking, I am just going to fill the chat with some links that are relevant to people and places that were referenced in our last video. Many of us have not heard of Richard Nugent. So there's more information on him in the link. Also, blues singer Gladys Bentley. There's a really interesting podcast that features her, so I'm putting that in the link as well. So one thing that I wanted to start as a discussion point for this first video, a few things that were mentioned in the video. So I'll read them off and then I'll pause so people can comment or reflect. The first thing that stood out to me was the mentioning of the downfall of the Harlem Renaissance was brought on in part by the Great Depression and also by the rise of conservatism in American culture. And then another point related to that, the rise of conservatism in American culture is one of the reasons why the Harlem Renaissance is not remembered as a time of gay liberation. I never connected those two ideas before watching that video. And then when they referenced retrospective closeting, talking about the process of if we speak about or learn about the Harlem Renaissance, the impact of LGBTQ community members, and their influence on that time is traditionally not highlighted, and how that was referred to as a retrospective closeting. And then the last point that stood out to me is the consequences of not teaching the period of the Harlem Renaissance as being inherently queer is that queerness remains white in the cultural imagination. I had never thought about the Harlem Renaissance through that lens. So I'm going to stop talking and remind us all that this is Courageous Conversations. So if you have something to add to the conversation, either a question or a comment, go ahead and put a question mark in the chat and I will know to call on you.
I just have a comment that I think it's always interesting that I don't know if this is just in the US or if this is something that happens around the world, but it's always interesting to me that there's this dividing out of history that in some ways, if we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, means that we have to focus solely on the Blackness of it, instead of saying, yes, it was Black, but it was also these other things, that there's always this division. And I know that's partly why we have, Black History Month and Women's History Month and AAPI, all these different months, where if we could just cover all of history to the best of our ability, then there wouldn't be this
retroactive closeting.
Yes, thank you. I was like, retrofitting. That's not right. So that's just my 2 cents there. It's too bad that we can't talk about the fullness of that Renaissance.
And I like the connection you made to all aspects of history. So for me, the question we should then be asking ourselves is, why is so much omitted? And who does that benefit? And who does that harm? And then the sectioning out, AAPI and Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month and Women's History Month is kind of a reclaiming of one's place. But what necessitates that? What is the root cause of why so much was omitted? Anyone else before we move on to our second video?
Yeah, Amy, excuse me. Just to comment on that, how do you tease out threads otherwise? And how do you get a grip on a whole? I'm not trying to pose a counter argument to what was just said, other than it can be difficult to grasp a whole when you have so many threads to it. So how do you focus on the various individual elements? The Harlem Renaissance, you've got a ton of figures there, from Marcus Garvey on to, all kinds of people that are involved in that. And those many dimensions of what we often stereotype as a single community, and without recognizing just the broader context. It's a challenge to do it, is I suppose what I'm saying. So an appreciation of what is being held up tonight, to try to tease out a thread of that and look at it more fully.
Thank you, Steve, for bringing that up. And my oversimplified answer is you start. You start and then you keep adding, because you're right. It is, when you think about what is left out, it's overwhelming. And so you just start. And I don't think there's any wrong place to start, but you have to continue to add until the breadth of that experience becomes clear, and with a commitment to accuracy. All right.
I agree. Thank you.
No problem. So our second video, I will go ahead and get that cued.
Vicky has her hand up, Amy.
Oh, thank you. Vicky, go ahead.
Well, the reason why we have all those different months is because history is told by the white folks, the European Americans, and the best way to look at it is what Dr. Daniels said at Juneteenth. White history is American history. Everybody else is hyphenated. And that was an awesome way to look at it. So that's my 2 cents.
Vicky, thank you for highlighting that. Anyone who missed Juneteenth, you missed it, but no worries. We'll be back again next year. Dr. Daniels did an amazing job as always. So thank you for making that connection and introducing that into the conversation. So the second video is Unsung Heroes Break Barriers for Black LGBTQ Community. And this one's a little bit more local. This focuses on Chicago.
And go do this to clear out stuff.
Black History Month is a time to recognize the cultural and historical contributions of African Americans in this country.
But how did Black History Month start? CBS News' Dana Tyler has more on the man known as the father of Black history.
No, hold on. I think when I was trying to get rid of the video, I bumped it forward. So give me 1 second to get back to the video we wanted to watch.
And that's a really important.
Here we go.
Is here. Chicago's North Halsted Street, where among the shops, clubs, and rainbow-paved crosswalks, you'll find the faces of those who paved the way.
People got marginalized and excluded and silenced in both movements because they were either Black in the gay movement or gay in the Black movement. And that's a really important story to tell, I think.
And there are many stories, like here, where a bronze plaque honoring the first American woman in space shares the same space with one of the founders of the civil rights movements.
Bayard Rustin helped make the civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s as visible and successful as it was.
John D'Amelio literally wrote the book on Bayard Rustin. A Quaker, student of Gandhi, who used nonviolent protest to bring cultural change.
He was Martin Luther King's mentor, and he imbued within King the idea that violence will only beget violence. If you're going to try and change hearts and minds, you have to do it through nonviolence.
Rustin organized the 1963 March on Washington.
This was before we had Xeroxing, before we had the internet, before we had texting. And in 7 weeks' time, he managed to create a March on Washington. And that brought 250,000 people peacefully to the nation's capital.
We march today for jobs and freedom. But we have nothing to be proud of. The hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here.
The late Congressman John Lewis was just a young man then.
I got in trouble. Good trouble.
And if Lewis was the father of good trouble, Rustin, many would argue, was the grandfather.
Without Bayard Rustin as the organizer, the March on Washington would have been like a bird without wings.
And like so many honored along this stretch of North Halsted in what's known as the Legacy Walk, Rustin lived in open secret.
He was a gay man. He was a Black gay man, and that information was not discussed at that time.
Chicago-based consultant Mary Morton says that's the story, the history of many Black LGBTQ Americans.
Lorraine Hansberry, who identified as bisexual and spent a lot of time, of course, in Chicago. Her seminal play, Raisin in the Sun, set on the southwest side of Chicago, was certainly something that meant a lot to me growing up on the far south side.
There's no area within the African-American life and culture in this country in which LGBT folks who are Black have not been central.
Filmmaker Thomas Allen Harris.
When you look at these images, what do these photographs mean to you?
Whose work includes the series Family Pictures USA, tells the untold stories we all have. Some are just hidden.
Family Pictures USA caption.
the LGBT contributions like Audre Lorde or James Baldwin. If we do include them, then we might kind of like whitewash their sexuality, and I think that does a disservice to this new generation that's looking for role models.
And when the people raised their voices, we didn't hear, but our deafness was only a temporary condition.
One of those role models, former Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
She became a central figure in the Watergate era.
A president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution.
And she delivered sort of a stunning rebuke to Nixon on live television. That is considered by many people to have been the last nail in the coffin of Nixon's presidency.
We must define the common good.
She was a phenomenal person, smart and erudite, really incredibly articulate.
Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot was just a girl when Jordan was in office.
People certainly knew, who her partner was to her, but to never be able to say, this is my wife, this is my husband, this is our life, and to really live it proudly and out, that does damage. There's no question whatsoever. And I feel sad for her, but I also know that what she did really broke through a lot of barriers and blazed a trail for people like me.
And in today's world, still with protests, the themes of equity remain the same, though the faces are different and more inclusive.
Well, when I'm looking back, I didn't hear much about LGBTQ history at all.
Jay Rice is part of a younger generation who believes the intersectionality of being Black and being LGBTQ are just now coming to terms.
We have finally reached a point in society where not only our Black counterparts, but all of our American counterparts and around the world have realized that queer Black people have been here forever, and we've contributed to society forever. And it's a sense of exhale to finally get a little piece of recognition.
It's harder being gay than it is being Black.
Recognition that's now much more mainstream.
You have Billy Porter, right, who is everywhere. And for a show like Pose, you have Laverne Cox, Janet Mock. It's really important for young people in particular to see possibility models.
Something Bayard Rustin could only dream of 60 years ago.
So here's a man that organizes the March on Washington from beginning to end, and he walks away, and he doesn't have any job offers, right? He doesn't have any place to go because he's still a marked man as a gay man.
America honors Bayard Rustin as one of its greatest architects for social change and a fearless advocate for its most vulnerable citizens.
In 2013, 26 years after Bayard Rustin's death, his partner at the White House accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom on his behalf. One of the first in the civil rights movement, becoming one of the last to get recognition for it.
I'm very glad that Rustin is receiving more recognition and more people are learning about his life and what his life can teach us.
This is a really interesting time. I think it's a time that we have to continue to highlight these stories.
They are stories dating back more than a century, from the Harlem Renaissance to today, of musicians and educators, artists and authors, all contributing to the American story and are now having all the chapters told.
It really shows us the complexity of who we are as African Americans, and that we are a village and we are very diverse, and forever LGBT folks have been really leaders within their communities.
And like so many things in history, there's always
All right, so while you are thinking of your comments and your reflections, I have some information pertaining to that video that we just watched that I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat so you can have that. The link to the video is already there, but for example, Family Pictures USA, which is on PBS, was also mentioned. So if you're interested in additional information, I will put that there. One of the individuals that were speaking was from Brave Space Alliance. So if you want to learn more about that organization, I'll put some information in the chat as well. Is there anything that was new for you in that video? Anything that you learned or anything like, oh yeah, I was aware of that, but I hadn't thought about it in a while? Go ahead and put a question mark in the chat. I'll know to call on you, or you can drop your comment in the chat if you want to type that out as well. Oh, Diane, are you trying to unmute?
Oh, good. No, I was trying to figure out because I have a new laptop and I didn't know how to get into the chat room. So I just want to say thank you for showing us this. You know, as a white person, I don't know much of any of this. So this is all good for me to hear about. And to think that what you're doing is moving in the right direction to let us know about these things so that we can pass this along.
Oh, well, Diane, that was very generous of you to say. My absolute pleasure. This is definitely a team effort. But we like to get a lot of information to put that in the chat. So hopefully people are holding on to that and sharing it with others. There is a comment in the chat. Unfortunately, all of this is new to me. Well, the good part is all of this is new to you, and you're learning a lot this evening. So it's all about the way we frame it. Anyone else want to comment on maybe some of the names they heard? Were you familiar with these individuals and their work?
Yeah, Amy, I'll make another comment. Rustin's certainly familiar with. He's received a lot of attention in recent years about being marginalized by the movement because you just couldn't have a gay Black man associated that closely with King. And, you know, when you think about the homosexuality was classified in the psychiatric manual until I forget what year it was. I think it was well into the 70s as a sickness. You realize the context of the difficulty of speaking out and the dangers of it. And we're living in a time when that marginalization seems to be rising again in terms of a kind of an anti-movement. So that's something to certainly be aware of it and keep an eye on and figure out ways to speak up and counter when comments are made to sideline any kind of association with that and to push that agenda on others.
No, good point. There is nothing new under the sun. So for us to make those connections is helpful in how we respond. So we will shift into our third video. I'll go ahead and put the link in. This features Marsha P. Johnson. Many of you may be familiar with Miss Marsha. So I will share my screen.
Now, as part of our Hidden Histories series, we look back on the legacy of a larger-than-life figure in her own community. Her contributions to the fight for gay and transgender rights were, until recently, largely overlooked.
I express
part of the gay movement this year.
She was fondly known as Saint Marcia, a central figure in New York City's gay liberation movement, a model for artist Andy Warhol, and an advocate for transgender and homeless youth. Marcia P. Johnson wore many hats, sometimes literally. They were often adorned with plastic fruit or flowers.
They call me Marsha P. Johnson. I'm trying to get around those things that happened to me in life. Absolutely no mind.
Assigned male at her 1945 birth in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Johnson started wearing clothes made for girls when she was 5, but felt pressured to stop after being sexually assaulted by a 13-year-old boy. As soon as she graduated from high school, she fled across the Hudson River to New York City with just $15 and a bag of clothes. There, she dressed as she pleased. While better than in her hometown, life in New York City could still be hard for those who didn't match societal norms. Cross-dressing was a crime in New York State, and Johnson was sometimes arrested simply for wearing makeup in public. Often unable to find a job and without a permanent residence, she turned to sex work. Johnson really enjoyed performing in drag. She was part of a drag group called Hot Peaches and took to the stage sporting red heels and bright wigs. Even though the bohemian enclave of Greenwich Village, where Johnson lived, was the focal point of the city's gay life, police still routinely raided gay bars there. During a late-night June 1969 raid on the Stonewall Inn, patrons fought back, and the modern gay rights movement in America was born. Johnson, who was 23 at the time, has wrongly been credited with throwing the first brick of the uprising. She said she didn't arrive at the scene until after the chaos had begun, one of the many transgender women on the front lines that night, because they said they had nothing left to lose. Johnson may not have started the Stonewall riot, but for decades to come, she was a key player in the LGBTQ plus rights movement that it sparked, even as many gay and lesbian groups marginalized transgender people. With longtime friend Sylvia Rivera, also a transgender woman, Johnson founded STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. The term transgender was not widely used yet. The political collective supported and housed homeless LGBTQ plus youth and sex workers. During the AIDS crisis that began in the 1980s, Johnson helped spread awareness and raise money. She looked after sick friends even as she struggled with her own mental illness and became HIV positive herself. In 1992, Johnson's body was pulled from the Hudson River. Police first called it suicide, then reclassified it as undetermined, and in 2012 reopened the case, which remains unsolved. She was 46 years old.
All right, so while I get the chat drops ready to put in, if anyone wanted to comment or reflect on the video we just watched on Marsha P. Johnson, who played a historic role in the LGBTQ plus rights movement, feel free to go ahead and unmute. So the first item I'm putting in the chat is the Marsha P. Johnson Institute and their most recent impact report. So there are links to the website and the impact report, and I'll just read this briefly. The mission of that organization, the Marsha P. Johnson Impact Projects, protects and defends the human rights of Black transgender people through advocacy, coalition, and capacity building. We intend to reclaim our relationship as Black trans people to our movement legacy. It is our reclamation of this that we give ourselves permission to reclaim autonomy of our minds, our bodies, and our futures. We were founded both with a response to the murder of Black trans women and women of color, and how that is connected to our exclusion from social justice issues, namely racial, gender, and reproductive justice, as well as gun violence. So that mission is also included in the information there. But any comments on the Marsha P. Johnson video? So this is my gentle, loving poke. Courageous conversations work best when we are engaged in conversation.
Amen.
All right. Well, I will continue on with what I have prepared, but I'll let you know now, if we don't have participation, we'll be ending early, which may be just fine. All right. So in the spirit of providing resources, this next video, again, we try to do global, national, and also local, and kind of weave those together when possible. So the next video is more local. Our last one was in Chicago. This one is in Milwaukee. So it's in response to recent transgender murders. And I know when I'm pulling videos, I always like to know how recent or how old this video. This video is actually from 3 months ago, so relatively recent. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
The city of Milwaukee has seen a disproportionate number of murders of transgender Black women over the past year. Police say 3 people have been killed since June. Cachet Henderson, Brazil Johnson, and Regina Maya Allen were each shot to death between last summer and late last month. The victims range from 28 to 35 years old. Joining us now is Chris Allen. He is the president and CEO of Diverse and Resilient. It's an organization providing services to LGBTQ plus people in Wisconsin. Chris, thanks for joining us on such an important topic. How are you and the LGBTQ members of the Milwaukee community reacting to these recent homicides?
Yeah, it's been difficult to deal with these recent homicides because it's affecting our community in ways that creates additional fear and increases discrimination that LGBTQ plus individuals, specifically trans individuals, are facing. So we're really trying to work hard to bring awareness to the challenges that our trans community is facing so that we can make a difference and stop the violence.
The ACLU is tracking a record number of bills. It says are anti-LGBTQ bills that have been proposed in the U.S. Why do you think we're seeing these kinds of policies being pushed now, and how are they impacting members of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, we're seeing it for a number of reasons. One of the most prevalent reasons that we're seeing it across the country is that it's an easy distraction for some folks to use LGBTQ people and our lives as in politics. And so it takes the focus away from some of the real problems that we have to address in our country and puts the blame and attention on a minority group of individuals that are greatly misunderstood, and there's a lot of stigma and discrimination that already exists. And so it's easy to feed off of that.
Chris, what actions do you think need to be taken to ensure the safety of the LGBTQ plus residents of Milwaukee and elsewhere?
I think it's important that we one, increase awareness around the challenges that LGBTQ plus individuals are facing, specifically trans individuals, and that we put a stop to a lot of these bills and the attention that's being put on stuff like Don't Say Gay, or the bills that we're seeing in Tennessee around drag queens and people people presenting themselves, wearing clothing that doesn't match their perceived gender. A lot of these bills place a disproportionate amount of impact on trans individuals. We see this when there's a lot of focus on trying to protect children. Children are not being harmed by transgender individuals. It's really a focus that doesn't need to happen. And so we're seeing a lot of increased violence because of the stigma and discrimination that's coming from this. There's a lot of misunderstanding around who transgender individuals are, what they do in their lives, and ways that they can interact within our communities. And we need to place more attention on the positive impacts that our LGBTQ plus community has.
As Nikki said, a critical issue. Chris Allen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. Announcing Madison Magazine's Best of.
All right. So that link to that video, in case you want to rewatch that or share it, is there in the chat. And I have a few other items to put in the chat as well. Chris Allen was representing Diverse and Resilient in Milwaukee. If you are interested in learning more about that organization, I'll put that information in the chat. And again, I'll just read this briefly. Their mission is to achieve health equity and improve the safety and well-being of LGBTQ people and communities in Wisconsin. And their vision, at Diverse and Resilient, we see a future in which gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in Wisconsin thrive, living healthy, satisfying lives in safe, supportive communities. And their name says, our name serves as a reminder that LGBTQ plus people are everywhere, engage in interesting and meaningful lives, and contribute to the welfare of each other and the broader community. So again, if you're interested in learning more about a local community, a local organization supporting the LGBT plus community, that information is in the chat. And then the last one, there was also a part of that video, is the Milwaukee LGBT Community Center. So it has their mission information and then the link if you want to learn more there. So with all of that being said, any reflections or comments for our last video? O'Neill, go ahead.
I just want to affirm what he said about it's a distraction from real problems that our society faces, that it's easy to scapegoat people. It's easy to use stereotypes. It's easy to stoke fear, and and it's easy to distract people from spending time and effort on important stuff, including our state legislators, our county board, it's easy to distract people from what's really important.
Thanks, Neil. Nancy, go ahead and unmute, please.
I haven't figured out how to use that little symbol that Vicki used about putting my hand up. So maybe somebody can teach me that. I'm reading another book now, and this it's called, for your information, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And I am really beginning to understand a little better this movement, which has been very strategic, this conservative movement. It's had its ups and downs throughout the 20th century, but it's really strong now. And one of the things they like to talk about is family values. But when you find out what their family values are, they're not the same as my family values. And I think that the main thing that has just, brought me to a way to really picture this is that it's all about patriarchal power. It's not just Blacks. It's not just gay and lesbian. It's not just women. It's, you know, it's anybody who is not a white male and they feel threatened by. And so we have to all be allies together because they are after all of us. They would take away, and they have taken away, freedom for women, Black and white. They don't care. They don't believe in democracy. And I think this is the thing that was the most shocking to me, that they really don't believe in democracy. So we need to keep educating ourselves, and we need to keep standing up for these values that we hold dear, that we feel are important, and support each other in it. Because as Neil said, it's a distraction, and they need a target to feel powerful. And so they will pick on what they think is the weakest target. But if we're all together, it gets harder for them, I think. That's just my thought. I'll unmute.
Well, Nancy, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And I believe that when we are all together, it's harder for people to dismantle us and to dismantle our power. Amy, I say, oh, and Nancy, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should have an option called reactions. And if you click on that, it's going to give you some different reactions. And one of those is to raise your hand. All right. Amy, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead and unmute.
When I was part of the planning for this, one of the things that I came across more than once was talking about trans murders. And one thing that I thought was very sad, like kind of interesting and sad, I guess, is that more often than not, those murders are of trans women, and more often than not, they are trans women of color. Something like 80% of murders of trans people are trans women, generally Black trans women. And so Neil, just going off of what Neil said about being involved with local politics, I don't do a great job of following the state legislature, mostly because I just get mad. But I do know that a couple weeks ago, they were talking about the new biennial budget, and there was some stuff in there about cutting Medicaid funding for gender affirming treatment. So just something to keep an eye on, because that also tends to affect people of color more so than white people. So just a little comment there for you all. So I don't know, I usually feel super frustrated when I try to reach out to politicians to say, hey, stand up for this group, because I'm not giving them thousands of dollars for them to do what I asked them to do. So I'm a little disillusioned right now with politics, but I still think it's important that we pay attention.
So a couple of things, and then I'm going to yield the floor to you, Neil, because I see that your hand is raised. One, don't get disillusioned. Don't underestimate the power of repeated emails and phone calls. And if you have the time, in-person visits, even if you're just communicating with staff of policymakers. And I completely get getting overwhelmed and frustrated with what's being done or the lack of what's being done. But there's this neat tool on and I'll have to go back and look, so I don't want to give you the wrong information. But if you go to like the Wisconsin legislator and it has the Senate and the Assembly, you can sign up for email alerts for specific topics or keywords. So they'll send me emails when there's movement on a certain bill under this category. And I found that that's been helpful to kind of streamline what you're intaking, but still kind of remaining abreast of what's going on, of things that you're really passionate about. All right, Neil, the floor is yours.
I'm picking up on what Nancy said again. The intersection between men and LGBTQ issues, I think, has to do with men who are not comfortable with their own manliness. And so the book that we are reading, about John Wayne and Jesus, the people who are promoting the patriarchy and well, there's one chapter in the book called Jesus will save your soul and John Wayne will save your ass. And the people who are promoting that are people who I think are just not comfortable in their own skin and not confident in their own sexual identity.
Neil, you just said a mouthful, and that comment is one of the reasons why I love you. So thank you for sharing that. Steve, the floor is yours.
Just a kind of follow-up comment on what Amy was saying. I have a trans nephew, and this is obviously anecdotal, but what I get from him is medical care is often a big challenge in how he is treated in the medical community. It can be used as a wedge issue and is being used by as a wedge issue of who is deserving of medical care. And if they're going to use medical care money for this trans stuff, they're not deserving. And that message needs to be countered for what it is in terms of just being absolutely inhuman and immoral.
Steve, thank you for sharing that. So we have a video clip that's going to talk about the intersectionality of LGBTQ community members and accessing healthcare. So I'm excited for everyone to see that and then kind of hear the feedback. Any other comments on anything that we've seen thus far before we shift and talk about housing?
I'm just wondering if Neil or Nancy can put the title of that book and the author into the chat so I can save it. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So our next video is actually talking about LGBTQ seniors and their fear of discrimination in housing, which is such a layered topic that I didn't realize until I was preparing for this. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to share my screen, and then we can all talk about the video clip after.
It's hard enough in this country finding safe, secure housing if you're elderly. Much harder still if you identify as LGBTQ. Tomorrow is National Coming Out Day, but tonight we have a story about some of the 2.4 million seniors who identify as LGBTQ going back in the closet. It's because many elderly gay and trans people fear mistreatment and abuse when seeking senior housing. The Fair Housing Act prohibits the denial of housing based on race, religion, or sex, but there is no federal law that explicitly protects people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. NewsHour Weekend's Yvette Feliciano visited one senior housing development in New York City that is making sure their LGBTQ residents are welcome.
Stonewall House in Brooklyn is an LGBTQ-friendly senior housing development. SAGE, an advocacy organization for LGBTQ elders, which created Stonewall House, says it is the largest such development in the country. The 145-unit building, which opened in 2019, is named in honor of the 1969 uprising, often cited as the beginning of the modern LGBTQ rights movement. 71-year-old Deidre Nottingham was one of the first to move in.
I said, finally, a house for us to stay in and not be judged, you know? I've been waiting a long time, over 50 years, for something like this.
You don't have to be gay or transgender to live here. To qualify, you must be at least 62 years old and earn 60% or less of the area median income. But the fact that Stonewall House welcomes gay and trans seniors is important to Nottingham. For decades, she says she faced housing discrimination and at points homelessness due to her sexual orientation. It began at 14 when she came out as lesbian and her family kicked her out on the street. It just got worse from there.
When I was younger, me and my girlfriend, they wouldn't rent to us. And it was hard because we couldn't go back home. My family didn't want us. And it's hard when they calling you a freak or a weirdo. I was called that a lot of time by my own family members. So it's very hard when you don't have no support. And there wasn't any groups out there where you could go to. We were lost.
Nottingham says before coming to Stonewall House, she lived in 8 other residential long-term care facilities over the last 12 years. Each included some level of neglect or hostility by staff and other elderly residents.
They did not want gay people there. They always made remarks and cursed at me when I came outside. So I just couldn't take it. I was afraid that they was gonna set my door on fire or something.
Were you ever tempted to hide who you were in these housing situations?
A couple times. I was scared.
According to Sage, gay and trans seniors face more obstacles than their straight counterparts. They're more socially isolated because they are less likely to have children and are more likely to live alone or be estranged from their families. And a lifetime of employment discrimination contributes to higher poverty rates among LGBTQ people over the age of 50, according to the UCLA School of Law Williams Institute.
It is truly a disgrace that there is no federal law prohibiting discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing.
Michael Adams is Sage's CEO.
And what that means is that about half of our LGBTQ older adults are living in places where there are no such protections because there's no federal law and there's no state law.
Sage reports that more than 1/3 of LGBTQ seniors fear having to recloset themselves when seeking housing due to discrimination and violence.
And their fears are real, and they're based in fact. Sadly, we hear over and over again from our elders that some of the places they feel least safe and most vulnerable to harassment and discrimination is where they live. So one of the big challenges we're dealing with is the vast majority of residential long-term care communities have no formal policies that are protecting and lifting up LGBTQ elders.
Sage teamed up with the Human Rights Campaign to create what it calls the Long-Term Care Equality Index. It says that only 18% of senior housing communities have policies that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. With 29 affiliates nationwide, Sage trains long-term care providers on how to support older LGBTQ people. This includes cultural competency, writing staff and resident non-discrimination policies, and having LGBTQ inclusive intake forms and marketing materials.
Many of the residential communities are run by faith-based organizations. While some of them are wonderful and are embracing of LGBTQ people, some of them are not, right? So we have numerous instances of blatant discrimination where these communities simply refuse to accept people because they're LGBTQ. And then if people are accepted, there's the question of, is this an environment where I can be open about who I am?
78-year-old Stonewall House resident Bill Meehan understands more than most.
Back when I was a young man, being gay was not the thing you ascribed to be. Being gay was psychological association, psychiatric association. To them, it was a disease.
A former Catholic priest, Meehan battled coming to terms with his sexual identity before finally coming out in his early 40s.
I gave myself a hard time in just trying to be who I was. And that's a terrible journey, and the idea that some people have to go back to that is just not right. This place offered an opportunity for gay people to find housing proudly. And it's not totally a gay house. It's a mixed community here, but it's a community that recognizes diversity. We celebrate diversity, and as different as we all are, we live together nicely.
Sage is lobbying Congress to pass the Equality Act, which would create federal anti-LGBTQ discrimination laws for housing. In the meantime, at the state level, it's pushing for legislatures to adopt a long-term care Bill of Rights for LGBTQ seniors. Deidre Nottingham has no plans to leave her one-bedroom apartment at Stonewall House because she feels safer than she ever has.
I'll be so happy when I wake up. And I haven't felt like this in a long time. It doesn't bother me being alone. I feel comfortable. I come downstairs 3 o'clock in the morning just to check my mail. That's how safe I feel. It makes me happy when I see somebody like me. It's refreshing. I'm home.
It's hard enough in this.
All right. So if you are like me, I learned so much for that video clip. The 3 things that stood out, and then I'll yield the floor to others. That one, the residents were less likely to have children. Fun fact about the Levies, I told my kids they can put us in an assisted living facility. My husband said, absolutely not. We took care of you. You're going to take care of us. And I'm like, no, just come visit me a lot and it'll be fine. But if you don't have children checking in on you, that could be a completely different experience. The second thing that stood out to me is that a lot of the residents were estranged from their family. So again, sometimes a lack in those connections and people to check on you and look out for you. And then the third thing, which is so layered and interconnected, more likely to experience poverty. So when you think about employment discrimination and how that can impact your financial bottom line, so you are more vulnerable to experiencing poverty, and then skyrocketing prices of housing, and then housing where you are safe and affirmed, is just so many layers. So those are the things that stood out for me in that video, but I'm curious what things were important to you or were of note. O'Neill, go ahead.
The thing that struck me is that the similarity between people of color finding housing and LGBTQ people finding housing. It seems like there's a lot of common threads there that people can identify with.
Absolutely. Nancy, you unmuted, go ahead.
I'm thinking there may be another factor involved, and they didn't mention it, but we know that the minorities are targeted by police often and are disproportionately incarcerated. And once that happens, that makes it more difficult when they are released to get housing. And I don't know if that's true for the LGBTQ community, that they are targeted by police for, enforcement of laws. I really don't know, but do know minorities are. And so that would make it even more difficult if they had any kind of a record, because then I think it's legal to, I think it's legal to discriminate against people with a record. So that was my comment.
Thank you, Nancy. And just to reflect back, and as we think about new bills that are coming up and some of them becoming laws about cross-dressing and wearing makeup in public, if that is not generally associated with your gender assignment, I think people are more vulnerable to potentially having police contact. So Janet, I see your hand up, and then Rich, we will come to you.
Go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I am listening to this and thinking of the similarities and differences between minorities and LGBTQ plus people, although they're minorities too. I know how minorities have been discriminated against in the past. I'm just reading that graphic book. What's it called? Stamped from the beginning, so that we people have learned that Black people are undeserving, they're less than, they're problematic, et cetera, from their entry into slavery in this country. But I maybe I'm really naive about this, but why is there such a stigma against LGBTQ plus people? Because we haven't had that opportunity to perceive them as some non-normative, evil kind of people, since, I don't know, I've lived too long and haven't known that much about them until in the last few years. And so for me, it's kind of a problem to figure out why I should have been trained better to not like them or to be afraid of them or whatever. But I will add this, and it kind of goes against what I'm saying. When I was in graduate school and teaching at the college level, I knew lots of LGBTQ people. And within that situation, there was no sense of like discrimination or difference or anything. It was just, they're just people like the rest of us. So I don't know, did I just contradict myself?
I'm going to let you determine that. A couple of things that I will point out with your last statement, and I'm paraphrasing, that the people you knew or encountered who were members of the LGBTQ community, that there was no discrimination or difference. I would suggest that that is the way you experience them. I think if you had a conversation with them, that they may likely tell you that, yeah, we experienced discrimination. And I think as you do more research, you'll see that members of the LGBT plus community have experienced demonization and marginalization and a representation that is forced on them that is less than desirable and not accurate. Right. Thank you for sharing, Janet. Rich, you have been waiting patiently. Please go ahead and unmute.
I might have said this in an earlier video, but I grew up across the river from Harlem, and I hung out in Greenwich Village all through high school. And where I grew up, including my family, were all civil servants, half of them cops. I never heard any disparaging comments about gay or homosexuals. And this might be a little controversial, but they were an easy overtime mark. Vagrants, gays, and other groups padded our wallets and put money on our table, because if you arrested a gay person an hour before your shift ended, you ended up booking them, which took about 3 hours overtime. And that was just the fact. It was such an easy mark that when I was hanging out for the 4 years in high school, there was no big deal, except we knew when the shifts were changing to stay off the streets, because you might get rounded up with some gay people just to, give some guys some overtime. I don't know what that means today. I think there's more homophobia, but back then in the early and mid 60s, we never heard of that stuff. So I just figured I'd add that.
Rich, thank you for adding to the conversation. And as you were talking, I was looking at it as, okay, one group was benefiting from the abuse and harassment of another group. And what was the harm that was caused? Like, what was the experience after you were arrested? Did you get out right away? Did you have to come up with bail money? Did that cause you to miss a shift or to lose employment, which could cause you to lose housing? So from one perspective, it could be seen as an easy mark to pad my wallet. And from the opposite perspective, that could have been a life-altering experience. Yeah. All right, so we are going to shift, and look at me. I thought we might unfortunately finish early tonight, which would have made my heart hurt. And it looks like we're in good time. So we're gonna shift and talk about healthcare, and we do a mix of national and local. Let me go ahead and put the link in before I get started to make sure everyone will have it.
Vicky has her hand up.
Oh, Vicky, unmute while I'm doing that, please.
So what I found interesting in all these videos is the almost cyclical nature of gay advancement. You know, like we're talking about the Roaring 20s, and they call it the Harlem Renaissance, which everybody's heard of that, but not the gay portion of it. And then we have the Depression and World War II. And then we have the Free Love 60s and the Stonewall, riot, and things, loosened up a bit. And then I can't think of an economic crisis other than Jimmy Carter's interest rates. But so then we get the same-sex marriage bill. And now we've got all these conservatives doing, turning 180 degrees. And it's just, that's 100 years ago, the gay Harlem Renaissance. That's 100 years. And it's just, I find it quite interesting, the yo-yo of people's acceptance and conservatism.
Great point. Thank you for highlighting that. Progress is rarely linear. And I think, Vicky, you did a beautiful job of highlighting that. So I'm going to share my screen and we will shift to healthcare. And this is from Mississippi.
Access to quality healthcare is crucial for every American, and yet it remains out of reach for so many. For LGBTQ people, the added risk of facing discrimination in medical settings means they often don't get the care they need. And that's especially true here in the South, where clinics that are accepting and affirming of LGBTQ people are hard to find. A problem that grows even worse in rural areas where access to healthcare is already limited. But here in Jackson, one doctor is trying to change that. Hello. You must be Dr. Rogers. I am. Dr. Rogers is an openly gay psychiatrist and co-founder of the Center for LGBT Health. How did this clinic come to be? When we began 3 years ago, we really didn't have much in the way of clinical care for the population. So we started asking questions about what was needed, what could we do to help the LGBTQ people living in Mississippi, and ultimately came up with the idea of opening a multidisciplinary clinic because there really had not been any kind of effort in that direction from within the medical center. So we thought we would do it. And we started the Center for LGBTQ Health.
La Roche-Posay and Thelia Green.
This multidisciplinary clinic offers pediatrics, internal medicine, mental health services, and more, all specifically geared to the LGBTQ community here. Did you sort of face any opposition to that? We didn't. I think a lot of people would assume in Mississippi, because it's a socially conservative state, you would assume there would be a lot of opposition. But what I found, which was a pleasant surprise, is that many people from across the medical center, when they began hearing about what we were doing, they contacted me and said, I want to be a part of that. So I'd love to show you around. Would you like to come in and see the clinic? Okay, well, great. Well, come on in. All of the different health concerns that this community faces that are specific to this community. So for my field in psychiatry, what we know is that there are higher rates of some of the more common illnesses like depression, and there's a higher rate of suicide. And the most at-risk group are the transgender youth and also transgender adults, but that's a very high-risk group. Mm-hmm. We're also just doing primary care here. Mm-hmm. And so we're managing things like hypertension and diabetes and all the things that any other clinic would do, but we're doing it in an environment
that is not judgmental, that is affirming, where it's completely free of prejudice, discrimination.
Having a space free of discrimination is critically important. In the Deep South, like Mississippi, it's legal for doctors to deny service to LGBT people based on religious beliefs. And to make matters worse, the South has the highest concentration of people living with HIV and AIDS in the country, with many calling it an epidemic. And results from one recent study showed that in Jackson, Mississippi, a staggering 40% of men who have sex with men are living with HIV. Yet, the threat of discrimination prevents many from seeking the care they need, something Dr. Rogers is determined to change.
I want to introduce you to a couple of people. Okay. So this is Dr. Joy Houston. Hi. And this is Wes McComas. And Wes is a Lyme patient here.
Nice to meet you. And so for you, Wes, what is it like to have a place like this to come to?
It's a breath of fresh air. I also am from Mississippi and grew up in Mississippi. And it's a place where I can be myself and have discussions, talk, and say whatever I need to say as a gay male. Mm-hmm. I came out in 1986. Mm-hmm. Anytime I went to get an HIV test right down the street from the health department, and I was told that I needed Jesus, they were more concerned that I was a sinner than the fact that I could be HIV positive. And that changed my life forever. Since then, I have had a very hard time going into clinics, trusting anyone, doctors. There would be things I would never tell them about. If I had a boyfriend or what I was doing, I wouldn't talk to them about it. And physically, there were things that happened because I didn't tell them. I kept it quiet because I didn't want to go through that again.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I go to the doctor, one of the most important things for me is being able to be as honest as I can about what I've been going through. If I'm going in for testing or for sexual health things, I need to be open about what, my sexual activity. I need to be able to be open about, my mental state, to be able to discuss and actually have adequate treatment. Do you encounter a lot of patients who are guarded when they're coming in here that sort of have to get used to the fact that this is an open space?
Not in this clinic, because we basically posted it on the door that this is an open space. This is a safe space. This is the place that we can come and get services and be assured that people are going to treat you in a respectful and affirming manner. Yeah. And I think that actually relieves a lot of the tension, at least for people that I've seen, because they're just sort of, they've got the guarantee at the door.
Yeah. How's your sort of healthcare changed since they've been open?
Well, my blood pressure's down. I actually can talk to a doctor who I know will take care of my needs. I didn't go to a doctor for a very long time, and I'm not a social worker. I mean, you think you can trust people, but this is deep down here. We talk about Mississippi being gay and the medical field, and I feel much healthier now. I really do. And I feel like I could come and talk about anything and get help. That means a lot to me.
Dr. Rogers is also dedicated to serving another group that often faces barriers when it comes to health services, the trans community. Despite the fact that there are over 500,000 trans people living in the South, Dr. Rogers and his colleagues are one of the few medical teams in Mississippi providing healthcare with a focus on trans issues. Were you trained in transgender issues when you were going through medical school? No.
For me, I went to medical school in the 90s and then did residency training in the late 90s, finished in 2000. And there was minimal coverage of the topic. Really no coverage of transgender health at all.
And so how did all of you get educated? What was your process of figuring out how do you care for these people?
For me, it was having been in Boston, I learned about the Fenway Clinic, and now it's called the Fenway Institute, serving 35,000 patients, half of whom identify as LGBTQ. Took a delegation from this university to Boston. We spent 3 days up there learning as much as we could. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot that's already understood and there's a process. We just had to learn it.
The need for better training and competency when it comes to trans health issues is huge.
Our patients are allowed to give them preferred names, their pronouns, and then we do everything we can to use that name and that pronoun as we communicate with our patients. We've also updated all of the policies in the hospital to be LGBTQ friendly. And that needed to happen. And so we're doing what we can now to try to educate the next generation of providers.
So you are actually impacting the way healthcare is happening in other areas, in other fields, across the board.
Because our mission is to improve the health of 3 million people calling Mississippi home, and that it includes LGBTQ health. So that's what we're trying to do. It means a lot to us that you came, though, and spent time with us this afternoon. Thanks so much for that.
And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
So as we wrap up tonight, are there any other comments or reflections that you want to share on the last video or any of the videos that we've seen this evening? And I'm just putting in the chat the organization that he referenced, the Fenway Health Institute. There's a link there if you want to learn more. Nancy, go ahead.
I'll try to be brief here. I think one thing that I want to share is that I have seen interviews with parents of teens who the parents accept what's happening, but like in Texas, but they can't get the care for their child. And basically for teens, it's puberty blockers. It's nothing major. But it makes the child feel better about themselves and less likely to be depressed and to commit suicide. So I just think, you know, it's ironic that the conservatives want parents involved in everything with the child's life. But when it comes to this kind of healthcare, now the parent can't even work with a doctor to get the appropriate healthcare for their child. It's ridiculous.
Very pragmatic. Neil, go ahead and unmute.
Just a piece of information. If you want to save the chat, what you do is go down to the bottom of the chat and there's 3 dots on the left-hand side. You click on those 3 dots and save chat will pop up and you click on that and the chat will be saved.
Thank you for that reminder, Neil. I am super proud of all of the resources and links. We usually do a pretty good job at our conversations, but we have so many for this conversation. There are lots of videos that I think are amazing, but they just wouldn't fit into our hour and a half together. Amy also found some articles, so those are in there as well. They're noted as articles on there. So yes, please do save the chat, go back at your own leisure and review those items. And most importantly, share them with someone who wasn't able to attend. All right, we have 3 minutes remaining before the parking lot opens. This may be a shock to everyone. I don't think I have any announcements. I have a couple points of gratitude. Thank you to everyone who attended our Juneteenth celebration at Telfair Park. It was another success. We had so many community members and visitors who came through. We had just over 50 vendors, and that was other nonprofit partners, food vendors, product vendors, and service vendors. So it was a wonderful day of learning and music and food and celebration. Can't wait to do it again next year. So again, the 3rd Saturday in June, which next year will be June 15th. And thank you to everyone. I think maybe some of you attended Yoga on the Square. This happened on the actual day of Juneteenth. It was our partnership with YMCA of Northern Rock County. They pick a different nonprofit every Monday. We have Yoga on the Square outside where the Janesville Farmers Market meets in that green space. They let me use our Stand Against Racism soundtrack. And it was just, I said last year, it was the thing I didn't realize I needed. And it was the same thing for me this year. So with that, I'm going to close my mouth. I'm going to yield the floor to Neil and then to Amy for partner announcements before we shift into the parking lot.
I can't think of any announcements for Diversity Action Team. You can always go to our Facebook page or our website and see what the activities are and other interesting things that are posted.
Sounds good. Amy, any community action updates or announcements?
The Merrill Community Center in Beloit has a bunch of stuff happening throughout the summer, and the Merrill Community Sharing Garden is also very busy. Here in Evansville, we have just kicked off a food and hygiene drive called Summer Hungry. Get it? Summer Hungry. Okay, I'm really proud of that name. Anyway, we're collecting some high interest food for families since when the school year ends, so do school meals. Just trying to add to our local food pantries shelves with good stuff for kids.
Hey, I love that you're doing that. Shameless plug for the School District of Beloit. They're going to be feeding sites. School District of Beloit is participating. I think the Beloit Public Library, State Line Family, YMCA, maybe
Merrill Community Center too.
Yeah, and they will feed anyone 18 and under. So you don't have to be like a school or whatever. If you are 18 or under and you show up, so please visit information for those sites to get the correct times, but they will feed any child 18 and under. So hopefully
adults can eat too, but you have to pay $4.
Okay, well, I don't know many places you can get a meal for $4, so I didn't realize that. Thank you for adding that on. So we have reached 7 o'clock. Thank you all for an amazing and robust conversation. Please do use those resources and links in the chat. I'm going to mute myself and stop the recording. Let me do that now and turn this